Okay, let's get started. Well, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. I hope you're all well. Today we're going to talk about payroll pitfalls and look at how you're managing your risk in payroll. So, good morning. I'd like to welcome you and thank you again for joining us. I hope you're going to find this webinar interesting and useful to you. So, by way of introduction, my name is Avril Craig and I'm the payroll director here at Henderson Loggie. Now, I've always worked in accountancy practice, but I've specialised in payroll for over 20 years. I oversee Henderson Loggie's payroll service, which consists of two service areas, payroll outsourcing and payroll consultancy. In our department, we have 13 employees and we service 500 or so clients. I'm absolutely delighted to be presenting to you today. So what's today's webinar all about? As mentioned, I've worked in payroll, particularly payroll bureau, client service and payroll consultancy for more years than I would like to put a number on. And in the course of my work, when I'm onboarding new clients to a bureau, or if I'm providing a consultancy service to clients that run their own payroll, I see many recurring themes where things are going wrong. And there are many common pitfalls that I see. So what I'd like to do today is share my experience of these with you, and I hope this will allow you to pause and consider your own payroll process and identify areas where there could be potential problems. Or even better, it might provide you with reassurance that you have all of this covered. Also, I'd like to look at ways that you can support your payroll team to help them to maintain the efficient, low-risk environment that you help them to create. If the risk is reduced and efficiency is increased, everyone's happy. After this presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A session, so please pop your questions in the Q&A box and I'll address them at the end of the webinar. However, it might be more suitable for you to take the question offline if it's very particular to you, and I'm very happy to do that too. So who's this webinar for? Today's audience is a mixture. We've got small organisations, large organisations, we've got business owners, payroll staff and HR teams. So the information I'm sharing today is pretty generic, so some of it might not apply to you or your organisation, and there might be things that apply to your organisation that aren't covered here. Now, if that's the case, please forgive me if I'm telling you something you already know, or if I've missed something that applies to you. I do think, however, that this presentation will at least give you food for thought, which is never a bad thing. And as mentioned, the Q&A session at the end, you've got your options to put your queries there or bring your queries to me directly. What we're going to look at today? Well, we're going to look at risk areas in payroll and really what CEOs, business owners, business managers should be concerned about, and how the payroll team within your organisation should be supported to mitigate risk. At the end of that, we'll look at areas of efficiency and what I consider to be best practice, and we'll touch on some technology as well. So what should the CEO or business owner or business manager be concerned about? In a nutshell, they should be concerned about risk. Now, most of us are very busy, probably way too busy, and our resources are targeted towards areas of the business that need our attention the most. Now, I generally find that payroll staff tend to be the most organised, diligent and reliable people. So it's easy to take them for granted and to take comfort in the fact that everyone's getting paid every month. No one's complaining, so that means that everything's running well. Well, it might be, and then again, it might not. And I've no doubt that in the vast majority of cases, payroll staff are doing a grand job, but you as business owners need to be sure of that. And the payroll team needs your support. So what I'm doing today is I'm urging you to take a peek under the bonnet, if you will, of your payroll process and perhaps give it a bit of an MOT. So in no particular order, here are the 9 most common risk areas that I've encountered in payroll. So risk number one is continuity. Think about who's running your payroll. Is it just one person? Do you have an excellent employee that ensures everything's tickety-boo and you'd be lost without them? Now, one of my clients was in that position and everything worked beautifully until the payroll administrator very sadly became ill suddenly, just a week before payday, and she was off work for 4 months. Now, you can imagine the scene in that office. No one knew the password for payroll software, let alone how to use it. No one knew how to handle new starts, sick pay, arrestments, never mind pension contributions. It was all a complete foreign language to them. Now, where that organisation went wrong was they relied on one person who knew how to do everything. The risk of relying on one person is huge, so please make sure you have a backup plan consisting of at least another person in the organisation, more if possible, to ensure that in the event of staff illness, your payroll service continues. Now, risk number 2 of the 9 risks, risk of lost data. Are you backing up your payroll data? If you do, that's great, but think about where does that backup sit? I remember a case where a very small but excellent payroll team ran their in-house payroll really, really well. However, there was not enough support given to them on the IT side of things within the organisation, and the payroll software and the payroll backups were both stored on the same drive, and there wasn't an overall system backup to cover that drive. Well, as fate would have it, that drive failed and it couldn't be recovered. So all the payroll data and all the backups were lost. Everything was gone and it had to be pieced together again. And that was a huge task. Now, all that was required there to prevent that disaster was a remote backup location, or even the use of cloud payroll software would have avoided this disaster. So think about how you're storing your payroll data and your backup, and make sure they're in separate locations so that one disaster isn't going to wipe out both. Risk number 3 is data security. Think about your employee records. How are your payroll records stored? How are payslips, P60s, P45s delivered to your employees? Now, GDPR regulations applies to all organisations, big and small, and the implications of a data breach are far-reaching and very costly financially as well as reputationally. A data breach occurs when an employee can be identified from the data, and that data has been delivered to another person or is somehow leaked. It only takes 2 items of data to identify someone. For example, a name and an NI number, or a name and address. And if this gets into the wrong hands, hey presto, you have a data breach. Now, we could create a whole separate webinar on this topic, but essentially in payroll, here are the rules that you should live by. All payroll data, reports, etc. should be stored electronically on a secure drive with restricted access. You don't want personal data being available to everyone in your organisation. If anything must be printed, it should be kept in a locked, fireproof cabinet. Payroll data should not be emailed, or if you must use email, then at the very least, ensure you have encrypted the document, and please don't email the password along with the document. I have actually seen this happen. Now, payslips, P60s, P45s, these forms that hold a lot of personal data. These should be delivered to your employee via a secure payslip portal. Most softwares these days offer payslip portals. If you've got some employees that insist on paper documents, you know, P45s, P60s and so on, we sometimes see this with people who don't like to use technology. So the way to get around this is to either post the document to the home address or ask them to collect the document and sign to say it's been collected. Please, whatever you do, don't leave this type of document printed and lying around. It's a huge data risk. Some other aspects of data security to think about. Laptops, they're easily lost, stolen, left in a taxi, that kind of thing. Please be careful of the data sitting on your local drive or desktop. Physical records can easily be ruined or go missing. Keep everything secure and never just have one copy or one backup of anything. I once witnessed a client who kept a pile of scrap paper to scribble on, and then they used that scrap paper to scribble on, and then it was disposed in a regular bin. Now, the only trouble was some of that scrap paper was payroll reports with personal data on them. Worst of all, misaligned P60s that's got a name, address, an NI number, and everything on it. So having this sort of, having this sort of data lying around your office and going into a bin is a huge risk of data breach. So avoid printing, and if you must print, make sure that the prints are disposed of by a correct shredding process. Risk number 4 of 9, we're getting there, data control procedures. Now, this really ties in with the previous point. However, I thought it best to present this as a separate item. How good are your employees at keeping you up to date with changes in their data, such as changes to their address or the bank account? It's really good practice to remind employees regularly about keeping you updated. I once had a client who posted their P60s to their employees, and a fair number of them never arrived. The reason was the payroll data was out of date, so P60s went to old or inaccurate addresses. It took a fair bit of work to track these down and have them returned. And remember, these being astray was a potential data breach. The lesson here is to regularly review and clean up your employee personal data. It needs to be accurate. It's a GDPR risk otherwise. When people open new bank accounts, the banks are very helpful in ensuring that all direct debits are transferred to their new account. However, this doesn't extend to direct credits, and it'd be quite an exercise to retrieve payments that have gone astray, and it's not always successful. All you can do as employers is regularly remind your employees to keep you updated. Most payroll software has a facility for adding messages to the payslip. Definitely was worth considering this, and send this reminder regularly. If your employees do have a change of data, how would they let you know? Really the best way to handle this is to have a self-serve HR system, which allows them to log in and input the change themselves. I've often seen phishing emails which seem to come from people in your organisation which say, here are my new bank details. And guess what happens then? You change the bank details in good faith, only to find that the message didn't come from your employee. It came from some evil person who's now stolen money from you. Even if you don't have an HR system, have an agreed internal system for data change, which allows you to be sure that the change instructions are genuine and have come from the correct source. So risk number 5 is loss of knowledge. Again, I've seen this happen more than one occasion. When you've got a member of staff doing the same job month after month, they know the job by heart and it just flows and we don't worry. But what happens when that staff member leaves? I made the point earlier when I talked about an employee going off sick, but it can be worse when someone leaves. Suddenly, all of that accrued knowledge is lost. No one knows how to access software, what the processes are, what the deadlines are, how to access the pension scheme, and on and on and on. Procedures, even though it's so well known by one person, they need to be documented and updated so that that knowledge can be shared and it's never lost. Risk number 6 is quite a big one, really. Risk of data entry error. So, data entry, you key the data in and you check it. So what's the problem? Why am I talking about risk? Well, there's two things really. Firstly, it's so easy to make data entry errors. Even once you've checked your entries, sometimes you see what you expect to see. We're all human, we all make errors, so there must be a robust checking system in place. All data takes different forms across organisations, but things like reconcile totals with the master data. But remember, this isn't going to reveal something being allocated to the wrong employee. Exception reporting. How does the employee's pay compare to last month? Peer checking. Get someone else to check your work with a fresh pair of eyes. Coming up with a suite of checks that's suitable to your organisation to cover all angles really is essential. The second point I want to touch on is, how do you enter your data? If you're still keying in bulk data, then it's worth investing a little time to look at the alternatives. Every organisation's data takes a different form, as I said. However, more and more these days, HR systems talk to payroll systems by data export, import, or by API, which is Application Program Interface, which means that the system flows from the HR system directly into payroll. There is still lots of work to do once the data's in, but finding a way to automate bulk upload will allow more time for quality control checks, which I'll touch on shortly. Using this import, export, or API model means the data is only entered once. So if you take the example of a new employee, the employee fills in a new start form, then HR key this into the personnel records, then payroll key this into the software, and perhaps the pension scheme. So that's 3 different points of data being keyed in. But if you've got an HR system which can at least export this new employee data, which will allow payroll to import it into the software and create a pension feed from it, then you're using the original keyed data and the risk of keying errors is reduced. It also creates efficiency because there's a lot of time saved there. Now think about all the data that you key in. You've got bank account numbers, national insurance numbers, dates of birth. The more often they're keyed, the more chance there is of keying errors. It's up to us to take the best care of employee data to ensure we don't create any problems for them. Risk number 7, risk of insufficient quality control. So you've entered the data and maybe you've even imported it. You've ensured that it's all entered accurately, so you finish the payroll process and that's it. One of the advantages of saving time with improved data entry methods, efficient data entry methods, is freeing up time for quality control checks. This gives you more time to focus on output and not just the process of inputting data. Checking output, quality control, it's a crucial part of the payroll process. Remind yourself that your employees' livelihood and retirement savings are in your hands, so having a system in place to ensure that everything is running correctly really is highly desirable. Now, wider than that, the organisation's compliance with GDPR, the pension regulator, HMRC requirements, quality control checks targeted at these areas are vital. Here's some of examples of the things that you should be looking at. On an organisation level, payroll software parameters should be checked maybe at the start of the year by carrying out some manual calculations. The start of the year is when things change, so that's a good time to check it. This gives you comfort that all the annual updates have been implemented correctly. What about apprenticeship levy and employment allowance? Are you handling these things correctly? These are so easy to get wrong, especially if your organisation is connected to other organisations, as the position of all the companies in a group must be considered together. Now, that decision shouldn't be left to the payroll team because they're not going to have access to all the information about all the companies in a group. So this is why it's a board level, business owner level decision and not payroll decision. Think about things like gender pay gap report. Are you required to prepare one of these? Payroll teams don't always have access to all the required information to make decisions about things like gender pay gap report, apprenticeship levy, employment allowance. So again, this decision should never just lie with payroll. It's a CEO board level decision. So that's the organisation level of things that should be checked on a quality control basis. Looking at the operational month by month employee processing level. Auto-enrolment, it's one of the most common areas where I see errors. It's frightening how much I've seen actually. Auto-enrolment is a payroll function, but only to a certain extent. The overall responsibility, which is huge, lies with the business owner. Once a payroll is run, is there a process to check that all eligible employees have been enrolled into the pension scheme? It should be checked and reconciled every payday for the sake of your employee's pension fund, as well as ensuring your compliance is spot on. Is there a good understanding of how tax relief on pension contributions work? Net pay arrangement, relief at source, qualifying earnings. It's not uncommon to see cases where there's little or no understanding of how this works within an organisation. And if that's the case, how can you be sure that things are running correctly? Is there a good understanding of which pay elements should and should not be pensionable? That comes from a good understanding of the type of pension scheme you have and the certification level. Are you remembering to re-enroll your employees who have opted out every 3 years? Now, I think it's really worth, and I'm emphasising auto-enrolment as being one of the biggest risk areas. I would urge all organisations to take time to consider if the overall understanding of auto-enrolment legislation and procedures is sufficient within your organisation. National minimum wage. You've probably heard a few things on the radio about this recently because HMRC are currently turning the heat up on compliance in this area. The regulations were amended in 2020, just before the pandemic. So we didn't hear too much about this through the pandemic, but HMRC are, as I said, turning their attention to this now. The thing about minimum wage is people's perception is, well, I'm paying my employees £10.50 an hour, so it's above minimum wage, so I'm not worried. But actually, ensuring your employees are above minimum wage per hour isn't enough. You need to consider other areas. There's a lot more to minimum wage than just the hourly rate. You've got to think about what type of worker they are. Do you make deductions from them? And is that going to cause a minimum wage breach? For example, deductions for uniforms and clothing. Do you operate salary sacrifice scheme? And are you aware that it's the post-sacrifice pay that has to be considered for minimum wage, not the pre-sacrifice? Are your employees working for longer than they're paid for? Even if, for example, if you say to them, I want you to come in 15 minutes before you start work, just to make sure you're here on time. They should be paid for that 15 minutes. And if they're not, it's a minimum wage breach. Statutory payments, things like maternity pay, paternity pay. Rules surrounding entitlement to this and reclaim of statutory payments are extensive and they really need to be fully understood and checked. Please don't just rely on your payroll software to get this right. Things like alabaster rules for maternity pay, that's quite a, it's not very well known, but it does apply. What would you do if you've got an employee who's going on maternity leave and they're in a salary exchange scheme? What steps do you need to take there? I am going to be delivering separate webinars on auto-enrolment and national minimum wage, along with some other important topics. I'm really just touching on a few examples here to raise awareness that these are subject to quality control risks. Risk of insufficient technical training. Over the last 15 years, payroll has become increasingly technical and complex. It's changed beyond recognition. In my view, it's no longer sufficient for payroll teams just to read HMRC's year-end bulletin, and that's them sorted for the year. Operationally, there are so many technical areas to be aware of. To use the words of the Chartered Institute of Payroll Professionals, payroll is a career. There are many levels of training and qualification available. For example, here at Henderson Loggie, we invest in continual professional development and qualifications via the Payroll Centre, and that keeps us up to date. Without a regular programme of updates, workshop, training, knowledge enhancement, knowledge can quickly go out of date. I'll give you an example of how that can impact a payroll. Once I carried out a review of a payroll, I found that the payroll operative automatically changed the 60-year-old female employee's national insurance category to letter C, and that meant that employee was no longer paying employees' national insurance. This action stopped being applicable in 2010 when the pension age started to increase. The operative thought they were doing the correct thing, but this happened due to their knowledge being stale, and this impacted the employee who didn't have enough national insurance credits at their retirement age. Another payroll review revealed that tax codes were not being implemented as, in inverted commas, nothing came through the post. That's what I was told. But actually the codes were arriving from HMRC, and someone else within the organisation very nicely and diligently filed them away because they weren't sure what they were there for. So how could that have been prevented? Having the codes delivered electronically would have circumvented that. The staff didn't know that you could actually have your codes delivered electronically. So we sorted it out for them, and then that was the problem solved. Earlier in this presentation, I gave some examples of the things that commonly go wrong in payroll, and I would say that lack of sufficient training is a big part of the reasons that things go wrong, simply because we don't know what we don't know. So having your knowledge refreshed on a regular basis really is vital. It's not on the payroll team. I would say it's down to the business owner to facilitate training. It's part of giving payroll the recognition and the support that it requires. Right, we're on the last risk area now. So, risk of no disaster recovery plan. So what could go wrong? It's only payroll. Well, what if we can't get into the office? What if there's a power outage, a flood, inclement weather, so nobody can get into the office, public transport disruption, a police incident cordoning off the area so you can't get into the office, IT issues, cyber attack on your system failure, key people being off sick, no one's available to step into their shoes. No one else has knowledge how to access things. Now, all of these occurrences are probably rare, but they're there potentially they can go wrong. So what I'm saying is, think of the potential incidents that could cause a disruption in your payroll process and make a contingency plan to cover these. I would also add to this a continuity plan, which picks up on some of the points I raised earlier. Is there a succession plan? Is there shared knowledge of systems and procedures? So I want to look now at how the payroll team should be supported. I'm hoping that insights are provided today into the risk areas in payroll will raise awareness of these and raise awareness that it's not solely down to the payroll team to deal with them. All the risks I've mentioned with a bit of work can be mitigated, prevented and controlled. I would highly recommend that time is invested into considering these risks and maybe others that you identify, because this list is not exhaustive. Take steps to address them. A good first step is to record all the payroll procedures, processes, protocols, and update these regularly and use this as your guide. I'm sure you will agree that your employees are your greatest asset. So we must remember that their livelihoods and their retirement funds are in your hands. It's therefore really incumbent on the CEOs and business owners to ensure that payroll staff have the required framework, resources and support to ensure that your staff are paid accurately and on time with little or no risk of the process failing. So what can you CEOs and business owners do to support the payroll team in their work? Invest some time and resources into your payroll operations. For example, ensure you have enough experienced staff to cover the payroll operations. Stress test your operations. Think about potential disasters and service interruptions. Things that can, make contingency plans for as many eventualities as possible. Embrace technology. Make the best use of systems available that will free up the operator's time in inputting data and therefore allow them to focus on quality control, peer checks, and so on. Invest time and money into staff technical training and development. Have regular external reviews of your payroll and its operations as a reassurance to you and your staff that all is well. These are just some suggestions of things that can help make everything work better. Right, let's look at efficiency. How can we increase efficiency? Now, the answer to this, of course, will vary from organisation to organisation because everyone's got a different size and shape and so on. But using technology to deliver accurately and efficiency to the payroll process really is vital. The advancement of bot technology is accelerating, and all organisations should be at least aware of this and start making plans for looking at how they can embrace this technology or risk being left behind. If you're not quite ready for this, then as a first step, think about looking at what's available now to make things easier for you. Do you use an HR system? Does it speak to your payroll system? Think about your new start process that I described earlier. A new employee comes along, fills in a new start form, it's keyed into HR system, it's passed to payroll, keyed in there. The new employee details are keyed into the pension portal. We need to look at processes like this and think about how can we import the original keyed data. Now, once I helped a client who had a really great payroll team, but the way the things did was so efficient. The employees completed a handwritten timesheet which detailed the jobs they worked on with a 13-digit job code and the time spent on it. So each timesheet could be about 6, 7, 8 lines long. The payroll team entered all of this onto a spreadsheet very nicely and accurately. Then the payroll team keyed in each timesheet into the payroll software and made sure it agreed with the spreadsheet. So the data entry part of this process was so time consuming and extremely prone to error. The time spent on this would be much better spent on checking the quality of the data output. This is one area where embracing the use of technology is vital. There are many time recording systems available which will link directly to your payroll software. Even if that's too costly for you, consider using something like Smartsheet, where the timesheet is uploaded to one master sheet, which compiles the total for you and is likely to be able to be converted into an importable form. So that's the end of my presentation. I really hope you found it useful, thought-provoking, or maybe challenging. I simply urge you to ask yourself if your payroll operation does have risk areas, and if so, what changes should you make to mitigate these risks? If you take away from this is that I haven't told you anything you don't already know and you have everything covered, then I'm so happy for you. That's wonderful. That'll give you reassurance. If it's made you think about areas of risk in your business that you need to consider, then I've accomplished what I set out to do and I'm delighted. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm now going to look at some questions that have been raised. Right. Bear with me, I'll look at these questions now. Are there any pitfalls specifically associated with HMRC basic PAYE tools? I would say, yeah. I mean, that system is perfect for working out your tax and national insurance. It's not going to produce a pay slip. It's not very good for auto-enrollment. It's not going to give you reports. As far as I know, I don't think you can import data into this. So maybe if you've got 1 or 2 employees, it's good. But there are alternatives out there that aren't very expensive and it's going to give you a lot more resource and facility. So it's definitely worth looking around. Now, I've also been asked, in cases where there's sickness, but we want to pay in full, is it best practice to note SSP, but also the amount we are paying to top up full pay? Yes, absolutely. I think it's really important to show that distinction. You know, most organisations will pay full pay for a certain length of time, and then it'll go on to maybe half pay, and then on to SSP only. So starting that SSP recording partway through the absence is, you know, it's not good. It's going to create a few complications. So I would record every single episode of sickness absence within payroll. Now, I've got a couple other questions here. If you bear with me. Here we go. Sorry about that. So how do you ensure new start information is collected accurately? So firstly, I would suggest that you try and avoid handwritten forms if possible and get everything typed, just because sometimes people's handwriting is a bit poor. In any case, you should be carrying out right to work checks for employees. And if you're carrying out right to work checks, what you can do is you can see, you know, just, let's say you're looking at their driving license as evidence that they've got, you know, they're a UK citizen. You can see their address, you can check the accuracy of that. Another thing that you can do, if they give you bank details, you can take the bank information and you can put it through a bank account checker just to make sure that you've got all the digits correct, and that will soon let you know if there's something wrong there. On minimum wage, am I breaching minimum wage regulations when I'm paying a salaried employee on minimum wage a 12th of their salary, because some months are longer than others? So yeah, I'll go into this in detail on another webinar soon. However, in this case, I know exactly what you mean. So for example, May had 23 working days and we're only paying salaried employees for, I think it's 21.6 days. So what you need to do in this case is work out their annual hours at the end of the year to make sure that they've been paid for every single hour that they've worked. There's a lot more to minimum wage than just the wage rate. So if you're concerned about that, I would suggest you tune in to the next webinar. Also being asked, are there any HR systems available for small numbers of employees? Yes, there are a lot of systems evolving. Now, we're not affiliated to any one provider, but I think a quick Google search will show ones like People HR, Breathe HR. There's definitely affordable ones out there, if that's something that you're interested in. So someone's asking me, where can we go for payroll training? We operate Sage Payroll. Are they the best? Sage are good. They'll definitely give you good updates. If you want more formal training, there's the Payroll Centre, which I can send links on to anybody who's interested in that. They do qualifications, but they do assessments and training and what have you. If that's a bit much for you, you know, we do updates here. It's something that we could help you with. We do quarterly updates for people. But there's a lot of resources online, and I'd probably suggest you use the employer's guide as a guide to the things that you need to know about, and just keep reading the information that's out there on HMRC's website. ACAS is a good resource too. But if you're looking for training, formal training, then I would suggest looking at the Payroll Centre. Now, someone's asking me, I was sent an invitation for this webinar from someone else in my organisation. Given that you now have my details, will I receive invitations to the further webinars directly? Don't want to miss them. I'd have to speak to our marketing people about that. If you want to drop me an email just to say that, and I'll make sure that you're on any lists, because we don't just send out to everybody unless they want invitations sent out. So yeah, drop me an email and I'll make sure that you're on the list. Okay, so I think that kind of wraps us up now. Unless anybody's got any other questions. I hope that you found this useful and informative. I'm really grateful for you all attending. Please do feel free to pop me any questions you have, and I hope to see you again on future webinars. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.